For many of us, you hear the word terrorism and, well, your mind probably jumps straight to September 11th, 2001. Big defining moment.
Absolutely. Images seared into memory.
And this idea of global terrorism changing everything. But what if our whole understanding of it, the word itself even, is kind of built on stereotypes, misconceptions?
That's exactly what we want to get into.
Today, we're diving deep into, terrorism. It's shaped global politics for, well, centuries, actually, but it's still one of the most contested, most controversial ideas out there.
It really is.
We've taken your sources a really comprehensive look at global politics, and we're going to, unpack the key insights, maybe challenge some of those assumptions along the way.
Right. Our mission here isn't just to say what terrorism is. It's more about why it's so incredibly difficult to pin down, how it's changed over time.
And all the disagreements scholars have about it, its nature, its significance.
Exactly. And we'll also look at the very different ways people have tried to counter it and what the fallout from those strategies has been.
So by the end of this, hopefully you'll feel a bit more equipped, able to see the complexities behind the headlines, maybe look at the word terrorism a little differently.
That's the goal, a richer perspective.
Okay, let's unpack this then. It might actually surprise you that what we call terrorism now, it's not just a modern thing, not at all.
Far from it.
Some of the earliest examples go back centuries, like take the Sicarii, they called them baggermen, an extreme group, part of the Jewish zealots back in the 1st century. They used killings, kidnappings against the Romans in Judea, and even against fellow Jewish people who worked with the Romans.
Their aim was pretty clear, wasn't it? Chaos, fear, disrupt Roman rule.
Totally. And then you've got the Thugi, or thugs, in India, a cult doing ritual killings, supposedly for the goddess Kali.
Right. They became really well known under British rule in the 19th century.
Yeah, but some evidence suggests they might have started way back, maybe like the 13th century.
So these examples, they really push back against that idea of terrorism being just, a recent invention. It has this long, complicated history.
Definitely. But what's really fascinating, the word terrorist itself, it doesn't even come from those ancient groups.
No, it's much later. And the origin is, well, quite telling.
Where does it come from?
It actually comes from a period of pretty brutal state-sponsored violence during the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, 1793 to 94.
The Reign of Terror, okay.
Yeah, this was the Jacobins under Robespierre. Mass executions, up to 40,000 people killed, supposed enemies of the revolution.
40,000, wow.
So the word terrorist, right from the get-go, points to violence by a state, not rebels or small groups.
Huh. That really complicates things, doesn't it? Our usual picture is non-state actors.
It immediately complicates it. It forces you to ask, can a government be a terrorist? If a state uses systematic violence and fear against its own people, what else do you call it?
That's a really unsettling thought. Okay, so fast forward a bit. When did Western societies first really start associating, terrorism as we think of it now, with non-state groups?
That happens much later, really late 19th century. It's linked to this upsurge in violence by anarchist groups. It peaked in the 1890s.
Anarchists, right.
And they practiced what they called propaganda by the deed.
Propaganda by the deed. What does that mean exactly?
Basically, the idea was, don't just talk about revolution, do something dramatic, shocking. Let the act itself be the propaganda.
Ah, okay. Like make a statement with violence?
Exactly. Use violence not just to destroy, but to raise political awareness, get the masses thinking, maybe even spur them to revolt. Often by hitting symbols of power, symbols of oppression.
We saw that.
Oh, yeah. Attacks on Tsar Alexander II in Russia, 1881. Empress Elizabeth of Austria in 98. King Umberto of Italy in 1900. Even Presidents Carnot in France, 94. McKinley in the U.S., 1901.
So high-profile targets.
Yeah, very high profile. And symbolic targets, too. Like the bombing of the Café Terminus in Paris in 1894. That was explicitly called an attack on bourgeois society.
Right. And wasn't there something about Greenwich Observatory?
Yeah, same year, 1894. A man, later identified as a French anarchist, accidentally blew himself up near the Royal Observatory in London. That incident actually inspired Joseph Conrad's novel, The Secret Agent.
Huh. Small world. And this anarchist violence didn't just stop then, did it?
No, it had another wave, sort of in the 1960s and 70s. Groups like the Baader-Meinhof Group in West Germany, the Italian Red Brigades, the Japanese Red Army, even the Angry Brigade in the UK, all drawing in part from those anarchist ideas of shaking the system through violence.
Okay, so we've got state terror, then anarchist propaganda by the deed.
Oh.
What comes next in this evolution?
Well, after World War II, especially from the 1940s and 50s onwards, we see a really significant shift towards nationalist-oriented terrorism.
Nationalist, meaning?
Tied to struggles for national identity or independence. Very prominent in anti-colonial fights in Africa, Asia, the Middle East.
Okay, I see.
And later, it was adopted by national liberation movements.
Mm-hmm.
Think of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, or groups like Black September.
Right.
But it wasn't just anti-colonial. It also became a tactic for, disaffected national or ethnic minorities within established Western countries.
Like who?
Like the IRA, the Irish Republican Army in Northern Ireland and Britain, ETA, the Basque Group in Spain, and the FLQ, the Quebec Liberation Front in Canada.
So a really wide range of groups using similar tactics for different nationalist goals.
Exactly. And understanding this history from state terror to anarchism to nationalism, it's absolutely crucial for grasping why the definition is so slippery and why so many different kinds of actors get lumped under this one term, terrorism.
Okay, so given all that history, all that variety,
Right.
what's the core idea if we try to boil it down?
Well, the core understanding generally is that terrorism is a particular type of political violence. It's specifically designed to achieve its aims by creating a climate of, fear and apprehension.
Fear and apprehension, so not just killing people.
Not just that. The death and destruction are often means to an end. The main goal is to generate this widespread unease, this anxiety about future violence. What might happen next?
Right, that uncertainty.
Precisely. And that's why terrorist violence is often clandestine, relies on surprise, sometimes seems completely arbitrary. It maximizes that uncertainty.
Which is why civilians often get targeted,
Yeah.
to make everyone feel vulnerable.
That's often the reasoning, yes.
Mhm.
Indiscriminate attacks on civilian targets. But it's also important to remember, attacks on symbols of power, government buildings, monuments, or kidnapping and killing prominent people, like officials or business leaders, those are also widely seen as terrorism.
Okay, so the key thing is creating that climate of fear. That's what sets it apart, making us worry not just about what happened, but what could happen.
That's the core idea, yeah. But this is where it gets really tricky. Because even with that core understanding, the concept itself is still deeply problematic.
Why? What makes it so hard to define clearly?
Well, partly it's confusion about what basis we should even use to define it. Traditionally, people look at three things. First, the act itself. Clandestine violence seems indiscriminate.
Okay, seems straightforward enough.
But it's not, because the nature of terrorism isn't inherent in the violent act. It depends crucially on the intentions behind it. The desire to intimidate, to terrify.
Ah, the motive.
Exactly. Think of it like this. The violence is a brutal fact. But calling it terrorism, that's a social fact. It depends on our values, our perspective. Who's doing it? Who are we?
So it's subjective, depends who's telling the story.
Very much so. It's not just about what happened, but who's framing it and what they want you, the listener, to believe.
Okay, so the act itself is tricky. What's the second basis?
The second is its victims,
Wrong.
often defined as innocent civilians.
Right, and that sounds reasonable.
But again, problems arise. Does that definition exclude attacks on soldiers? Or assassinations of political leaders? Are they not terrorism? And furthermore, some groups we label as terrorists don't see civilians as innocent at all. They might argue civilians are guilty because they benefit from or participate in what the group sees as an oppressive system, nationally or globally.
So from their view, there are no innocent bystanders.
That's the argument sometimes made. So defining it by the victims runs into trouble too.
Okay, third basis.
It's perpetrators, usually thought of as non-state groups trying to influence governments. Terrorism from below, you could call it.
Right, like rebel groups, clandestine cells.
But if we only focus on that, we risk ignoring terrorism from above, or state terrorism, violence carried out by governments themselves.
Which, as you said, is where the word originally came from.
Exactly. And state terrorism can involve much, much more extensive killing of unarmed civilians than non-state groups usually manage.
So this raises a huge question, doesn't it? If the state is supposed to hold monopoly on legitimate violence, can it also be a terrorist? If it uses fear systematically against its own people, is that terrorism?
It's a profoundly important and uncomfortable question. And it pushes us way beyond the common understanding.
Okay, so definition is messy. How does terrorism differ from other kinds of political violence then? Like, say, conventional war or guerrilla war?
Good question. Compared to conventional warfare, terrorism is often called a weapon of the weak.
Weapon of the weak.
Yeah, meaning it's typically used by groups who just don't have the strength, the numbers, the weapons to take on their enemy in a straight fight like in a conventional war.
So they use different tactics?
Right. They rely on provocation, polarization, trying to wear down the government's will, make them overreact, rather than defeating them militarily. Some even see it as the negation of combat, because targets are hit where they can't easily fight back.
Okay, that makes sense. What about guerrilla warfare? That also seems like asymmetrical fighting.
It does, and they share similarities. Both are types of asymmetrical warfare, trying to compensate for weakness against a stronger enemy. Both often aim to corrode the enemy's will over a long struggle.
And sometimes they overlap.
Definitely. Terrorism is often used as a tactic within a broader guerrilla war or insurgency. Think of the Taliban in Afghanistan or ISIS in Syria. You could almost see terrorism as a special kind of new war sometimes.
That there's still differences between pure terrorism and guerrilla war?
Yes, key distinctions. One is terrorism's disproportionate reliance on highly publicized atrocities. These acts are designed to grab attention, shape how people think and behave.
That propaganda of the deed idea again.
Exactly. High visibility, shocking acts, meant to show the government looks weak, or to intimidate people, or maybe even mobilize support. That focus on maximum visibility for a wide, maybe global audience is really characteristic.
And the second distinction?
The second is usually about popular support. Guerrilla armies typically need, and try to cultivate, a mass base of support among the population. They operate more openly in controlled territory. Terrorist activity, being much more covert, usually restricts their ability to do that kind of mass mobilization.
So less connection to the wider population, more focus on shocking acts for an audience.
Broadly speaking, yes. While they're related, that focus on shocking visibility and often the lack of a large, active, popular base tend to set terrorism apart.
Got it. But, I mean, this term terrorism, it's just so loaded, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's hugely ideologically contested, very emotionally charged. Some people just refuse to use the word at all because it's either too vague or carries such negative baggage.
And it's almost always used against your opponents, right?
Almost always. You rarely hear a group describe itself as terrorist. It's a label you stick on the other side. So it becomes a political tool, really, a way to declare a group illegitimate.
Which leads to that really fundamental question, is terrorism just plain evil, always wrong?
That's the mainstream view,
Yeah.
generally. An attack on civilization, maybe even nihilistic, believing in nothing.
Yet not everyone agrees.
No. Some radical scholars might argue that, in certain situations, terrorism or other political violence could actually advance political justice, maybe counter other, more widespread violence or oppression, suggesting it could be justifiable in some contexts.
Wow. Okay, that's a really complex moral landscape.
It is, and it connects to a warning from critical theorists. Be careful about essentializing terrorism.
Essentializing, meaning...
Treating being a terrorist like it's an inherent identity, like being French or Catholic or something.
like it defines everything about them.
Exactly. And when we use that single label terrorist for groups as different as, say, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, Boko Haram, the IRA, ETA, we risk completely ignoring their unique histories, politics, cultures, motivations.
We just flatten everything into one category.
Precisely. We strip away the context. So the question for you, the listener, is, when we label a group terrorist, are we just simplifying things too much? Are we missing the complex reality behind the label?
And that ties into how language shapes our reality.
Yes, that's the post-structuralist idea. The discourse around terrorism, the words we use, the stories we tell, actually constructs how we see it. Calling someone a terrorist versus a freedom fighter isn't just semantics. It shapes their legitimacy, their entire image.
So the label tells you as much about the person using the label as the person being labeled.
In many ways, yes. It's a judgment, loaded with politics and morality, not just a neutral description.
Okay, so we've got this incredibly complex, historically deep, and definitionally messy concept, which brings us to a big debate. Has terrorism itself fundamentally changed recently? Is there something new about it?
That's the core of the new terrorism debate. The idea is that terrorism has transformed, become somehow more radical, more devastating. This really took off after 9/11.
But the idea was around before then.
Oh, yes. People were already talking about it, spurred by things like the Alam Shinrikyo sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway in 1995.
Right, the cult attack.
And the Luxor massacre in Egypt in 1997, where 62 tourists were killed. Those events already felt different to some observers.
Okay, so what makes this new terrorism supposedly new? How do people categorize it?
Well, one useful framework comes from Michael Ignatieff. He outlined 4 types. First, insurrectionary terrorism. Aims to overthrow the state through revolution. Think anarchists or communist groups like the Red Army faction in Germany.
Okay.
Second, loner or issue terrorism, focused on a single cause, like abortion clinic bombings in the U.S., or that Aum Shinrikyo attack again.
Got it. One issue, maybe one person or small group.
Third, nationalist terrorism, trying to overthrow colonial rule or gain independence for a specific group. The FLN in Algeria, the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, Hamas, Hezbollah, they fit here.
Right. We talked about those earlier.
And finally, global terrorism. This is aimed at hitting a global power, maybe trying to change global civilization itself. Al-Qaeda is the classic example usually given here, but you could argue some white supremacist terrorism fits too.
Okay, that's a helpful breakdown. But the lines can blur, you said.
Absolutely. These categories aren't always neat boxes in the real world, but they give us a starting point.
So what's the defining feature that proponents of new terrorism point to? What makes it different?
The big argument is that religious motivations have largely replaced secular ones.
Religion over politics.
In large part, yes. If you look back at traditional terrorism, especially after 1945, it was often tied to nationalism, separatism, maybe Marxist-Leninist ideas, fairly concrete political goals like self-determination.
Okay.
But starting in the 1980s, religion really started emerging as a major driver for political violence. By 1995, one scholar, Bruce Hoffman, estimated almost half the known terrorist groups were religiously motivated.
Half. That's a big shift.
It is. And groups like Al-Qaeda, driven by this broad ideology of Islamism, which, to be clear, is a political ideology interpreting Islam for governance, not Islam Brown, the faith itself seemed to typify this trend.
So the argument is this shift in why they do it changes what they do.
That's exactly the core argument. Proponents say that when terrorism becomes a religious duty, a sacred act, rather than just a political tactic, several key things change.
Like what?
First, inflexibility. If your goals are divinely mandated, maybe really broad, like transforming global civilization, you can't easily compromise. You can't be bought off with limited political concessions. Compromise looks like betrayal.
So they're harder to negotiate with.
Much harder, the argument goes. Second, the moral context shifts. Violence isn't just a tool. It becomes symbolic, a kind of total war, maybe even a cathartic experience.
And that removes limits?
Supposedly, yes. It removes psychological, ethical, political constraints. Atrocities become not just acceptable, but maybe even necessary or praiseworthy. This is often used to explain why these groups might go for more indiscriminate, more lethal violence, think WMDs or suicide attacks.
Okay, inflexibility, different moral context. What else?
Third, organization. The claim is a shift away from traditional military-style command structures. Instead, you see these diffuse, amorphous international networks, loose connections between cells, support groups.
Like Al-Qaeda being described as more of an idea network?
Exactly. A leaderless jihad, as some called it. And we also see the rise of lone wolf attackers, especially with white supremacist terrorism, often radicalized online, with few direct organizational ties.
So the idea is religious motive leads to less compromise, fewer moral limits, and looser networks. A fundamentally different, maybe more dangerous threat.
That's the essence of the new terrorism argument.
Yeah.
Violence as sacred duty changes the game entirely.
One of the most, frankly, terrifying aspects often linked to this is suicide terrorism. You mentioned it. Has that really increased?
Dramatically. While it's not brand new, think Japanese kamikaze pilots in WWII, the frequency has shot up. Mid-80s, maybe 3 attacks a year. 1990s, about 10 a year. 2000s, over 100 a year. And between 2011 and 2021, the average was 228 attacks per year.
That's staggering. 228 a year.
It's a huge increase. And the common explanation usually points to religiously inspired martyrdom, especially with Islamist groups like Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah. The idea is you need that extreme religious fervor, that belief in an afterlife to motivate someone to kill themselves for a cause.
It seems logical, right? That level of commitment needs powerful belief.
It seems logical. But there's significant research that challenges this easy assumption. Robert Pape did a major study looking at all suicide attacks from 1980 to 2003.
And what did he find?
He found very little evidence linking suicide terrorism directly to Islamic fundamentalism or even religion in general as the primary driver.
Really? So what drives it then?
Pape argued most suicide terrorism happens in the context of nationalist or separatist struggles. And get this, the group that used suicide attacks most frequently during that period, the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka.
The Tamil Tigers, weren't they secular?
Exactly, a nationalist movement with a secular ideology, not religious fanatics.
So if it's not primarily religion, what's the explanation?
Pape points to strategic logic. Basically, suicide attacks are incredibly hard to defend against. They're an unusually effective tactic, especially for weaker groups fighting stronger states.
Effective in terms of damage.
Huge damage. The UN found that between 2011 and 2021, those 2,279 suicide attacks caused over 84,000 casualties. And nearly 80% of those were civilians.
Devastating numbers.
Beyond the physical damage, suicide attacks also carry immense moral force in a grim way. They demonstrate absolute conviction. They highlight the depth of perceived injustice.
So it's less about a religious death wish, more about a calculated, brutal effectiveness, like a precision weapon for the weak.
That's the core of Pape's argument. It forces us to consider the cold, strategic logic, not just jump to conclusions about religious fanaticism.
That really reframes it. But some people might still say, okay, strategic logic, but surely there has to be some fanaticism, maybe religious, maybe nationalist, to push an individual to that point. Calculation alone seems insufficient.
That's a fair point. And Pape's work doesn't necessarily deny that individuals involved might hold strong beliefs, including religious ones. The argument is more about why groups choose to deploy suicide attacks as a strategy.
Ah, the leadership's decision versus the individual's motivation?
Right. The leadership might see the strategic utility, it's effective, gets attention, hard to stop. They might then leverage existing beliefs, religious or nationalist fervor, to find recruits willing to carry it out. So it's maybe an intersection of strategic goals and powerful individual conviction rather than just one or the other.
Okay, that makes more sense. It's layered. But the whole concept of new terrorism itself, you mentioned it's criticized.
Heavily criticized. Many scholars argue the distinction between new and old or traditional terrorism is artificial, or at least way overblown.
How so?
Well, first, religiously inspired terrorism isn't new. We talked about ancient examples, but even in the 20th century, you had groups like the Muslim Brotherhood involved in violence since the 1920s. Nationalist groups like the Moros in the Philippines, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, they've mixed religion and politics for decades.
So the religious angle isn't unprecedented?
Not at all. Second, critics say plenty of traditional secular groups were just as fanatical, just as uncompromising, just as brutal as any new terrorist group. Think of the Tamil Tigers again, or the PFLP in Palestine, or the PKK in Turkey. They weren't holding back.
Okay. What about the organizational differences? The networks versus hierarchies?
That distinction is also seen as misleading by critics. Apparently, traditional groups, like the Provisional IRA or Fatah in the PLO, often gave a lot of autonomy to local cells. They weren't always rigid top-down structures either.
So if the religious motive isn't entirely new, secular groups could be just as brutal, and the organizational structures weren't always that different. What does that mean for the whole new terrorism idea?
It means we should be really cautious about these neat labels. It suggests that changes might be more about evolution and degree, rather than some radical fundamental break between old and new. It pushes us to look at each group and context more specifically, rather than relying on broad, potentially misleading categories.
Okay, so that's the debate around whether terrorism itself has changed. Now, what about this idea of it going global?
Right, another big theme.
Yeah.
But again, terrorism having an international dimension, that's not actually new either.
We mentioned the anarchists back in the 19th century.
Exactly. They saw themselves as an international movement, operated across borders in Europe, shared ideas, techniques.
And the leftist groups in the 60s and 70s?
Same thing. Baader-Meinhof, Japanese Red Army, Italian Red Brigades. They saw their fight against capitalism in the U.S. as a global struggle. They even collaborated sometimes. And the start of what people first called international terrorism is often pegged to the plane hijackings in the late 60s, mainly by Palestinian groups like the PLO. Suddenly, a local conflict was playing out on a world stage.
Okay, so international links aren't new. But the idea now is that it's become truly transnational, maybe even global in a deeper way, tied to globalization itself.
That's the argument. Terrorism as a child of globalization. There are a few reasons why. First, globalization means increased flows across borders, people, money, goods, technology, ideas.
Easier movement for everyone.
Right, and non-state actors, including terrorist groups, have gotten really good at exploiting this hypermobility. Moving funds, communicating, spreading ideology, it's all faster and easier.
Okay, what else?
Second, international migration. Diaspora communities living abroad can sometimes become crucial sources of funding or recruitment for campaigns back home. The Tamil Tigers, for example, got a lot of money from Tamils living overseas.
So globalization helps sustain the fight.
It can. And third, globalization itself creates pressures that can fuel militancy. This could be a backlash against Western culture spreading everywhere, seen by some as an invasion. Or it could be frustration over global economic inequalities, where some regions feel left behind or exploited by global capitalism, creating deep grievances.
So globalization provides the fertile ground, the infrastructure, and maybe even some of the motives.
That's the idea. It creates both the means and potentially some of the reasons for terrorism to operate on a more transnational scale.
But does globalization alone explain it? Particularly the rise of, say, jihadist terrorism.
Not entirely. While globalization provided the backdrop, the emergence of specifically Islamist or jihadist transnational terrorism is better understood as a response to specific political conditions and crises articulated through a politico-religious ideology.
Okay, what conditions?
Its rise from the late 70s onwards seems shaped by three main things. First, a lot of Muslim states faced crises of legitimacy. People were frustrated with corrupt, autocratic regimes. This fueled religious movements against these apostate leaders, the near enemy.
Right, fighting the government at home.
Second, at the same time, U.S. influence in the Middle East grew significantly, especially after Britain pulled back in '68. The U.S. became seen as the far enemy.
Aye, the far enemy.
Because of policies like strong support for Israel, U.S. troops stationed in places like Saudi Arabia and backing those same apostate regimes people were fighting against.
Okay, so local frustration plus resentment of U.S. influence. What's the third factor?
The third was a big growth in politically engaged forms of religious fundamentalism across the Islamic world. This got a massive boost from the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which seemed to offer a successful, powerful religious alternative to secular governments.
So those three things, legitimacy, crises, U.S. influence, rise of political Islam, came together.
They created the conditions, yes. Understanding those is key to seeing how what started as more regional or domestic struggles eventually went global.
How did that shift happen, from fighting the near enemy at home to targeting the far enemy abroad?
Well, through the 70s and 80s, the focus was mostly domestic jihad, trying to take power nationally. The U.S. and the West were kind of a backdrop issue.
So what changed in the 90s?
Basically, political Islam largely failed to achieve its domestic goals. Those apostate regimes proved tougher than expected. In places like Egypt and Algeria, Islamist insurgents were heavily repressed by the military, pushed underground, or forced out of the country.
So failure at home led them to look elsewhere.
In a way, yes. Facing defeat domestically, elements within the movement started to realign their strategy. They increasingly focused on the far enemy Western, especially U.S., policy in the Middle East and the Islamic world. Some scholars even argued this shift to global jihad was a sign of Islamism's decline at home, not its strength.
Interesting, like they needed a new target, a new justification.
Perhaps. And the Afghan war against the Soviets from '79 to '89 played a role too. It brought together fighters from many different countries, the Mujahideen. This forged a sense of shared identity, a corporate feeling among diverse Islamist groups, reinforcing the idea of a wider global struggle.
And this is the context where al-Qaeda emerges.
Exactly. Al-Qaeda came out of that milieu and is often seen as the prime example of global terrorism.
Why global? What makes it fit that category?
Well, its goals are explicitly transnational, even civilizational. It aims to, purify Muslim society, overthrow those apostate leaders, kick out Western influence, especially the U.S., and fight a larger battle against the perceived moral corruption of Western crusaders.
And its reach.
It's been linked to attacks all over the place. Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Kenya, the U.S., Spain, the U.K. It had or has cells and affiliates globally.
That does sound global and alarming.
It certainly appeared alarming, not just because it could strike anywhere, but because by framing its goals in these huge civilizational terms, overthrowing secular liberal society, it massively expanded the potential target list. If the enemy is a whole civilization, Anyone in that civilization could be a target.
That's a chilling thought. But you mentioned earlier this global nature might be overstated.
Yes, there are reasons to be cautious about how truly global it is, in at least 3 ways.
Okay, what's the first?
First, the whole Islamist or jihadist movement isn't one single unified thing, not even close. It's incredibly diverse. Lots of groups have very different beliefs, different goals. Many are really religious nationalists, or maybe Islamic nationalists focused on specific regions or the Muslim world, not genuine gold revolutionaries aiming to change the whole planet.
So lumping together attacks like 9/11, Bali, Madrid, London, Paris, as if they're all part of one grand plan, that might be wrong.
It might fundamentally misunderstand them. It's probably more like a loose collection of groups and grievances, sometimes overlapping, sometimes not, rather than a centrally commanded global army.
Okay, point one. It's not monolithic. What's the second reason to question the global label?
Second, look where the attacks actually happen. Yes, terrorism has affected many countries, but the overwhelming majority of attacks year after year are concentrated in a handful of conflict zones.
Places like?
Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, parts of Africa. These places see the vast bulk of incidents. Much of the world remains relatively untouched directly by terrorism. That concentration challenges the idea of a truly ubiquitous, everywhere-at-once global threat.
So it's geographically focused, mostly. What's the third point?
The third point is provocative. It suggests the image of Islamist terrorism as global terrorism might stem less from its own inherent nature and more from how others have responded to it.
Meaning the response created the image.
Potentially. The argument is that declaring a global war on terror actually helped create and sustain the idea that there was a single unified global terrorism to fight. It lumped diverse threats under one banner and gave them a global stage they might not have otherwise had.
Wow. So the question for us, for you listening, is, did the war on terror inadvertently inflate the threat? Did it shape our perception, maybe even make it seem more cohesive and global than it really was?
It's a critical question to ask. Did the response, in some ways, construct the phenomenon it was trying to fight?
That's a really powerful thought, fighting a reflection almost.
Okay, shifting gears slightly, but staying with evolving threats. Let's talk about something more recent, but deeply concerning. The rise of transnational far-right terrorism, white nationalist, white supremacist violence.
Yes, this is a crucial and growing issue. It's happening across many Western societies, often alongside the increasing popularity of more mainstream far-right or alt-right parties and groups. Think of groups like the English Defence League, or UKIP in the UK, Alternative for Germany, Vox in Spain, the Proud Boys in the US. So it's not happening in a vacuum.
Not at all. And this form of terrorism, its roots are deep in online culture, and its reach is definitely transnational, if not fully global yet.
And the transnational links are clear?
Chillingly clear. Look at some major attacks by individual white supremacists.
Yeah.
Norway, 2011. An attacker killed 77 people, mostly young, left-leaning activists.
We'll cover that. Horrific.
Charleston, South Carolina, 2015.
Yeah.
A man murdered 9 African Americans in their church.
Yes.
Christchurch, New Zealand, 2019. An attacker murdered 51 Muslim worshippers at mosques, injured nearly 50 more. And here's the direct link. He explicitly cited the 2011 Norway attacker as inspiration, communicated in similar online spaces.
So these attackers, continents apart, years apart, were connected.
Connected by ideology and connected through the online world where they reinforced each other's hate. It's a shared, toxic narrative crossing borders.
What is this shared narrative, this white supremacist cultural politics, as you called it?
It's this ideology brewing in far-right internet communities where these attackers were often active.
Yeah.
They talk about a culture war, they promote white supremacy, often mixed with intense misogyny, homophobia, transphobia.
And their targets reflect this.
Absolutely. White left-wing activists, black people, Muslims. These are often the key enemies identified in these online hate spaces. And what's really disturbing is how their manifestos, these documents they often leave online, tend to share core themes and even explicitly reference each other.
Like the New Zealand attacker referencing the Norway one.
Exactly. And the themes are depressingly familiar, portraying Muslims and Islam as a fundamental threat to the West, racist opposition to any non-white migration, and classic Nazi or neo-Nazi hatred of black people and Jewish people. It's a nasty cocktail of old and new bigotries.
And the U.S. seems particularly affected.
Well, it's happening elsewhere, too. A UK member of Parliament, Joe Cox, was murdered by a far-right extremist in 2016. The U.S. has unfortunately been a real hotbed. Beyond Charleston, you had the Pittsburgh synagogue attack in 2018, 11 Jewish people murdered. The attacker linked his anti-Semitism to the idea that Jewish groups were helping Latin American migrants.
Right.
Then El Paso, Texas, 2019, 22 people killed in a majority Hispanic city, the attacker railing against the Hispanic invasion of Texas.
Horrific.
And then, of course, the storming of the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. Thousands of Trump supporters, including armed far-right militants, 5 people died. It was widely called a terrorist attack, an attempted insurrection. Even a very conservative senator like Ted Cruz initially called it a violent terrorist attack.
He did walk that back later, though, didn't he?
He did, under pressure. But the initial label stuck for many. The frequency and scale in the U.S. are deeply concerning, especially when you consider the next point. This is maybe the trickiest part. The direct lines these terrorists often draw in their manifestos between their own extreme ideas and things said by relatively mainstream right-wing figures, commentators, journalists, even academics.
Mainstream figures? How?
The themes often overlap. Things like migration, free speech debates, views on Islam, gender, sexuality. It's not necessarily direct endorsement, but the terrorists see echoes of their own beliefs in more mainstream discourse.
That's really disturbing, a blurring of lines.
Exactly. This mainstreaming of far-right talking points makes it incredibly difficult to tackle. It's an insidious kind of normalization.
And this creates problems for security services.
A huge blind spot. White supremacist terrorists often pull off attacks despite leaving clear early warning signs online, sometimes practically announcing their plans.
Why are the fines missed?
It might be because counterterrorism policies, especially post 9/11, have often, in practice, focused almost exclusively on Muslim populations. There's criticism that these programs have constructed Muslims as inherently suspect communities,
So they're looking in one direction.
while a threat grows in another. This narrow focus might explain, partly, the failure to anticipate or mitigate the rise of far-right extremism. They weren't looking for it in the same way.
And the online spaces fuel it.
Absolutely. Certain forums have become incubators for this toxic mix of racism and misogyny. They provide community validation. Some attackers, like the one in New Zealand, even live stream their atrocities. They use platforms like 4chan, 8chan, almost gamifying terrorism, trying to get a higher kill count than the last guy.
Gamifying mass murder, that's beyond chilling.
It shows a deeply disturbing online culture, and it highlights a critical vulnerability if our security focus remains too narrow or biased.
Okay, so we have these evolving complex threats. Terrorism is elusive, dangerous. How do societies, especially liberal democracies, actually counter it? It seems incredibly hard.
It is incredibly hard. Terrorists often lack a fixed base. They blend in with civilians. And protecting against surprise attacks, kidnappings, bombings, suicide attacks is notoriously difficult.
So what are the main strategies? What are the options?
Broadly, you can group counterterrorism strategies into 3 main categories. First, strengthening state security. Second, using military repression. And third, trying to make political deals.
Okay, let's take those one by one. Strengthening state security. What does that involve?
This is a traditional approach, especially in countries with long experience of terrorism, like Israel, Sri Lanka, Spain, the UK. Often involves special emergency laws.
Giving the state more power.
Essentially, yes. And after 9/11 and other big attacks, many more countries beefed up their security measures. The basic idea is to take away the advantages terrorists get from operating in open, democratic societies and a globalized world.
Advantages like?
Like rights and freedoms, checks on government power, the ease of moving across borders in our borderless world. These things make democracies vulnerable, so the state tries to claw back some control.
How do they do that specifically? What kind of measures?
Mostly by extending the government's legal powers. Things like tightening control over money flows globally, stricter immigration rules, especially during alerts, and much more surveillance and monitoring of people domestically, particularly groups deemed extremist or individuals seen as sympathizers.
And detaining suspects.
That's a big one. Powers to detain terrorist suspects have often been expanded. In the UK, for a while, they could hold suspects for 28 days without charge, though that went back down to 14 days. In the U.S., the Patriot Act, passed right after 9/11, allowed indefinite detention of immigrants considered security risks.
Indefinite detention, wow.
But sometimes, state security measures have gone beyond legal powers into this extra-legal or quasi-legal territory.
Like Guantanamo Bay.
Exactly. The Bush administration after 9/11 went furthest here, establishing the detention camp at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, using extraordinary rendition, basically, grabbing suspects and sending them to other countries for interrogation outside U.S. legal oversight.
And the treatment of detainees there.
Highly controversial. They were subject to military courts, initially outside the U.S. Supreme Court's reach. They weren't classified as enemy combatant, so the administration argued the Geneva Conventions didn't fully apply, and interrogation methods like waterboarding were used, which are widely condemned as torture.
So these measures pushed legal and ethical limits pretty hard.
Extremely hard. And the debates and consequences surrounding places like Guantanamo are still very much with us.
Okay, so strengthening state security. What are the downsides? Seems like there must be some.
Two big ones. First, you risk endangering the very liberal democratic freedoms you are supposedly trying to protect. It creates this really tough trade-off. Liberty versus security. That sparks huge debates.
Right. This hits home for people. How much freedom are you, the listener, willing to sacrifice for perceived safety? It's a core dilemma.
It is. The second big drawback is that these measures can be counterproductive, especially if they seem to target specific communities often. Young Muslim men have felt unfairly profiled.
Which can backfire.
Massively. It can cause alienation, resentment, potentially increase support for extremist groups, or make recruitment easier if people feel unjustly targeted. One scholar, Richard English, argued that terrorists want states to overreact. An ill-judged, heavy-handed response can create panic and actually serve the terrorists' goals by validating their narrative of oppression.
That reinforces the point about bias, too, doesn't it? If security measures focus too much on one group,
They risk missing other threats.
yeah.
As we discussed with white supremacist terrorism attacks happening despite online warnings, possibly because the counterterrorism spotlight was pointed elsewhere, mainly at Muslim communities.
So the bias isn't just unfair, it's strategically risky.
Precisely. It's worth noting the Obama administration tried to shift the tone somewhat, acknowledging this imbalance.
Yeah.
The ultimately unsuccessful push to close Guantanamo, stopping harsh interrogation techniques that was partly about trying to rebalance liberty and security and repair damage to the U.S. image. The challenge isn't just being effective against terrorism, it's doing so without destroying the values you claim to defend.
Okay, that's state security. What about the second strategy? Military repression. Going after terrorists with force.
Right. This became very prominent with the War on Terror. It usually involves two main tactics. First, denying terrorists state sponsorship, basically.
Yeah.
Overthrowing regimes that help or harbor them.
Like the Taliban in Afghanistan in 2001.
Exactly. And alleged links to terrorism were also part of the justification, however contested, for overthrowing Saddam Hussein in Iraq in 2003.
And the second military tactic.
Direct attacks on terrorist camps, leaders, fighters, trying to disrupt their operations, take out key figures. Decapitation is sometimes the goal.
We've seen plenty of examples of that, haven't we?
Oh, yes. U.S. airstrikes in Afghanistan and Sudan back in '98 after embassy bombings. The attacks on the al-Qaeda leadership in Tora Bora in late 2001. Israel striking Hezbollah in Lebanon in 2006.
And the killing of Osama bin Laden.
The bin Laden raid in Pakistan in 2011 is perhaps the most famous example. Plus, throughout the 2010s, Western airstrikes against suspected terrorists in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria became almost routine. Drones, special forces, that whole image is tied to this military approach. Sometimes it's more concerted, too, like Russia's wars in Chechnya or Sri Lanka, effectively crushing the Tamil Tigers militarily.
Let's dive into that bin Laden killing. It felt like a huge moment. How did it unfold?
It was May 2nd, 2011. U.S. Navy SEALs raided a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. It was the culmination of this massive, years-long hunt for bin Laden, especially after 9/11.
And he'd been hiding out there.
Apparently, yes. He'd escaped the bombing in Afghanistan in 2001, likely moved around Waziristan in Pakistan, and then might have been living in this custom-built compound in Abbottabad, surprisingly close to Pakistan's military academy, possibly since 2005.
How did the U.S. justify the raid legally and morally, especially since it was inside Pakistan?
They framed it purely as national self-defense. They argued bin Laden was still an active threat, a lawful military target. They cited Article 51 of the UN Charter on Self-Defense and UN resolutions passed after 9/11.
But it was controversial.
Hugely. Critics called it an extrajudicial killing, basically assassination, part of a wider U.S. policy. The fact he was shot dead, not captured, and his body reportedly buried at sea fueled that view.
And the violation of Pakistan's sovereignty.
Yes, Pakistan wasn't warned beforehand. That caused a major diplomatic row. Some argued they should have tried to arrest him, put him on trial internationally, set a legal precedent, not just a military one.
What about the impact? Did killing bin Laden really cripple al-Qaeda?
That was the big debate. The U.S. government hoped it would deal a major blow, assuming bin Laden was uniquely important operationally and symbolically. The head of the snake idea.
But the other view?
The other view was that if al-Qaeda was already more of a decentralized network, an idea, then bin Laden was mainly symbolic by that point. Killing him wouldn't end the movement. His myth might even live on. From this perspective, the raid was maybe more about U.S. domestic politics, restoring national honor, boosting President Obama, than a strategic knockout blow.
So, does this decapitation strategy, taking out leaders, generally work?
The record is pretty mixed, honestly. Sometimes argued to be ineffective or even counterproductive.
Why counterproductive?
It can cause a backlash, generate huge resentment locally, especially if civilians are killed. It can be seen as heavy-handed foreign interference. And while al-Qaeda Central did decline after bin Laden, the broader network, its affiliates and inspired groups, persisted globally.
So the bin Laden raid shows the complexities. A tactical success, maybe, but with big ethical questions and uncertain long-term strategic impact.
That sums it up pretty well. It's a microcosm of the dilemmas in military counterterrorism.
And more generally, can terrorism really be defeated just by military force?
It's very difficult. Attacking terrorist groups often means attacking the symptoms, not the root causes, the political grievances, the social conditions that might fuel recruitment.
And the track record isn't great.
Often quite poor. Think of Israel's long struggles, Northern Ireland, Algeria, Chechnya. In many cases, massive state violence just seemed to breed more terrorist violence, a vicious cycle. Though the military defeat of ISIS, which held actual territory, is often cited as a counterexample, where overwhelming force did dismantle the group's caliphate, at least physically.
And military action can backfire politically, too.
Hugely. Especially if it's insensitive to human rights or civilians. The Abu Ghraib prison scandal in Iraq in 2004 with the torture and abuse photos, that did enormous damage to the U.S. image, fueled anti-Americanism, played right into extremist propaganda.
So when terrorism is part of a wider insurgency like in Iraq or Afghanistan, winning militarily is almost impossible.
Many military experts would say yes. You might reduce the violence to manageable levels, but you can't really eradicate it completely because the underlying political issues remain unresolved by force alone. Which makes you ask, is the moral and practical cost of endless military action worth it if it can't solve the fundamental problem?
Which brings us logically to the third strategy, political deals, trying to find a political solution.
Exactly. And in a way, most terrorist campaigns do end politically, not militarily. Over time, they often realize they can't achieve their ultimate goals through violence alone. Leading figures might start looking towards constitutional politics as the only realistic way forward.
And governments can encourage that.
Yes, governments have sometimes actively tried to draw terrorists away from violence through negotiation diplomacy, offering them a stake in the political process, a way out.
Have there been successful examples?
Definitely. Think of Northern Ireland. The willingness to engage politically with the Provisional IRA eventually led to the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, power sharing, and largely ended decades of Republican terrorism.
A huge achievement.
Or South Africa. Negotiations between the apartheid government under de Klerk and the ANC, led by Nelson Mandela, paved the way for the end of apartheid multiracial democracy in 1994. Another transformative political solution.
So the idea is a hearts and minds approach, address the root causes.
Exactly. Tackle the political grievances that fuel terrorism, and trying to convince militants they have more to gain by working inside the system than fighting it from outside. For Islamist terrorism, for instance, many argue that finding a just resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Palestinian question, would be key to undermining a major source of grievance, though that conflict itself seems perpetually stuck in military logics.
So focusing on causes and offering a political path can work, sometimes better than force.
It certainly offers a different, often more sustainable route than perpetual conflict.
But making deals with terrorists, that must be controversial too.
Extremely. It faces major criticisms. First, the charge of appeasement. Critics say it's basically giving in to violence and intimidation, a moral retreat. You're not standing up for your principles.
And it might encourage more terrorism by making groups seem legitimate.
That's the fear, that negotiating with them gives them legitimacy, a platform, potentially strengthening them or emboldening other groups to use violence to get to the table.
Okay, appeasement is one criticism. What else?
Second, limited effectiveness. Political deals seem to work best for nationalist terrorism. You can negotiate over power sharing, autonomy, maybe even independence, concrete things.
But not for other types.
It's much harder, maybe impossible, for religious or racist terrorism. What kind of deal can you make with a group that wants theocratic rule or a racially pure state? Their goals are often absolute, non-negotiable. How do you find a political solution with groups aiming to destroy liberal democracy entirely?
Good point. Very limited room for compromise there. Any other criticisms?
A third, more recent challenge is the growing link between terrorism, insurgency, and organized crime, especially since the Cold War ended.
How does crime complicate things?
Well, for groups involved in things like drug trafficking, smuggling, protection rackets, think Afghanistan, parts of the Balkans, DRC, Somalia, parts of Latin America, the money from crime can be huge. Peace and negotiation might actually look unattractive because it means giving up those lucrative criminal enterprises.
So crime creates an incentive against peace.
It can, unfortunately. The economics of conflict outweigh the benefits of a political settlement. So while political solutions are powerful, they're definitely not a magic bullet, especially when you're dealing with absolute ideologies or deeply entrenched criminal networks.
Right. We have covered so much ground here. It's been a real deep dive. Just to quickly recap the main things we've unpacked.
It's a lot to process.
Terrorism is, well, complicated. A contested word with a history much longer and more varied than we often think. Not just a modern thing.
Definitely not.
This whole new terrorism idea, the debate around religious motives, different organizations highlight some real shifts, but maybe the distinctions are sometimes overblown or not entirely new.
Right. The critiques are important there.
Globalization has clearly changed the game, given terrorists new tools and reach. But whether modern terrorism is truly global in nature, that's still debated. Maybe our own war on terror response shaped that perception.
A critical point to consider.
And crucially, this rise of white supremacist terrorism, a major growing threat, transnational, fueled by online hate, and it really challenges older counterterrorism models, potentially exposing blind spots.
A vital area of concern, absolutely.
And finally, countering terrorism involves these really hard choices. State security versus liberty, the effectiveness and costs of military force, the potential and pitfalls of political deals. No easy answers.
None at all, just complex trade-offs.
So thinking about all this,
Yeah.
what's the final thought you'd leave our listeners with? Something to chew on.
Well, maybe this. If we start thinking about terrorism more as a tactic, a brutal fear-inducing tactic, rather than some kind of inherent identity that defines a group completely, and if we recognize how much our own perception of it, its significance, is shaped by political language, by media narratives, by our own government's responses, what does that tell us about the actual nature of the threat? And maybe, just maybe, how effectively we can really counter it if we understand it differently. What stands out to you after hearing all this? How might rethinking these definitions change how you see things unfolding in the world?
That's a fantastic question to ponder. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the incredibly complex world of terrorism. We hope you feel better equipped now to understand the nuances, to ask those critical questions, and to look beyond the headlines to the deeper, often uncomfortable realities.